The next guide we're going to cover is a guide on the Tera forums by ChaosBlades. Now in this guide it discusses things like increasing your field of view, disabling mouse smoothening, and unlocking the frame rate. The only thing we're going to cover from this guide is disabling mouse smoothening, since the unlocking frame rate is no longer needed with a new ini file I'm going to show you that's by a user on the teratoday forums. So the only thing we're going to cover here is disabling mouse smoothening. What you'll want to do is you'll want to go into where you have Tera installed. For me, it's the C drive, program files 86, Tera, client, S1 game, and config. In here, you'll find all of these different inis as we've discussed, and you'll find the S1 input ini. You'll want to open that up, and what we're looking for here is one line, B enable mouse smoothening. Now what this does is if you have a controller and you move it very fast, it smooths out that motion. And with a mouse, that's not something you really need. You want your mouse to be quick and accurate and fast. And that line that's going to change this and make your mouse basically behave better in-game is only about the 8th line down. You're going to want to change this to false. It will be set to true. You'll want to change it to false. Then all you have to do is simply just save that, exit it, and although this has been told to me that you don't actually have to do this, I would still right-click Properties and make it read-only, apply, and OK. That'll stop the game when it updates from overwriting this file. And that's all we're going to cover with this guide. We're not going to cover unlocking the frame rate here or field of view, because a field of view is, I believe, something you can really search anywhere, and there's a ton of guides for it, and you can figure this out, especially with this S1 and input ini. What I will mention though is if you did make this read-only, you won't be able to edit it anymore unless you right-click, Properties, uncheck read-only, hit apply, and then OK. That'll allow you to edit it again, and after you've changed your field of view, which I'll link this guide so you can use this guide if you want to, you'll just have to right-click again, Properties, read-only, apply, and OK. And that's all you would need to do if you wanted to change the field of view, of course with a few extra line changes. We're also not going to cover unlocking the frame rate because the new ini I'm going to show you doesn't, and that ini is some serious work. It is probably the best experience you'll ever have with Tera if you use it. And in that ini, this isn't enabled. This is not how it's set up. So I'm going to trust that the author of the new ini knows what he's doing and has left this out on purpose. And I will too. Now, by far, if there's anything you're going to do from any of these guides, it's this one thing right here. This ini guide has improved my performance greater than anything else I've ever tried. Anything in the rest of the videos, any other little tweak you can think of, this one right here tops them all as the best I've had, the best experience I've had. My Tera experience has never been this good. To put this guy up on a pedestal, Techdude01 knows his stuff when it comes to a custom ini file. I'll include this link in the video description to Techdude's also improvement thread that also includes some other computer fixes as well. If you want to read through that, it's on teratoday.com. When you first open the guide, you'll come to his list of different fixes in this guide. What we'll want to do is scroll down a few posts until you come to the one about his personal S1 engine ini. And before we download this, there's something we have to find out. A lot of these changes are going to be off of how much onboard RAM your computer has and your GPU RAM. For me as an NVIDIA user, I can right-click on my desktop, go to NVIDIA Control Panel, wait for this to load, go to the system information down here in the corner, and that will tell me my GDDR5 RAM is 2048 MB. Now this is a number that I'll have to keep in mind later on in this editing process. This is something I'll have to remember. For an ATI user, I know you also have a control panel, something like this. I'm not sure how you get to it or how you would find this detail for yourself, but for an NVIDIA user like me, this is as simple as it gets. It's right here. Remember this number, 2048 MB, which basically means 2 gigabytes, because 1 gigabyte is 1012 or 1024. 1 gigabyte is 1024. I have 2048. That's 2 gigabytes. Keep that in mind. You can keep that window open if you think you might forget. I'm going to close it. Next, what we'll want to do is download this file. You'll click on the here on this part of his thread and download. And you'll see this pop up here. The password you'll have to enter is his name on the forums, exactly as it's written here, lowercase TECHDUDE01. Okay, that'll open up the zip file and you'll have access to this S1 engine ini. Now before we do anything with this ini, we're going to have to get rid of the old ini. And of course you don't just want to drag and drop and overwrite it. That would be a bad thing to do because if something goes wrong, you won't have a backup. My suggestion is to go to your desktop, create a folder called inis, and in it create an original and then one for Techdudes ini. Open up your original, drag your original ini into this storage folder. So now we have that original stored in an original, and then we have Techdudes ini here, which will be empty at the moment because it will be a storage in case something fails. You'll take his S1 engine ini and drag it into your Tera folder where the original engine ini was. And then that'll make sure that if something goes wrong, you have a backup. And you always want a backup just in case. So now we've come to the final part of this video, or of this ini rather, I should say, where we're going to change all of these values specific to you. Now this is a step you have to do, especially if you're an ATI user, because this ini file is specifically set up for an NVIDIA card, and there could be massive errors and bad things that could happen if you just simply drag this while using an ATI card. So if you're using an ATI, you have to pay attention because there are things you will have to change or this will not work for you. For an NVIDIA user, if you don't feel like touching any of this, you can try to drag and drop this and hope for the best. I would still go through and customize everything for yourself. I would highly stress that because there are things that can happen that you don't want to happen, and I would suggest you go through this with me and make the changes that are going to fit you, and so does the author as well. Go through, make it fit for your computer and what you want. So we're going to open this up. I'm using Notepad++ as I discussed earlier, but if you're using something else, there's number values here where each of these values are going to be found. So as we're going along, if you can't use the search engine for some reason, the numbers are here and you can use those and follow along as well. The first thing we're going to do is looking at B disable physx hardware. So if I use Control F, B disable phys, oops, I put a space in there. Fine, next we'll see B disable physx hardware. Now for an NVIDIA user, this needs to be false. For an ATI user, this needs to be true. So if I were an ATI user, this for me would be true. But since I'm an NVIDIA user, I want this to be false. Don't miss this step, that's a pretty important one. The next one we're going to go to is disable ATI. And you'll come to a disable ATI texture filter optimization checks. For me, this is true because I am on an NVIDIA card. If I were on an ATI card, I would want this to be false instead, and I would want this to be true. Now, since I'm on an NVIDIA card, I want my NVIDIA shader optimizations, or I don't want my minimal NVIDIA shader optimizations. I want this to be false because I don't want to use minimal, and I want this to be true. This is the original setup of the creator. because of the NVIDIA file. I've just left those two the way they are. If you do want to read up on anything else I'm talking about, which I forgot to mention, you can go to his guide and open the spoiler in this section, and it'll give you a nice detailed description of what each of his little added modifications do. So if you're curious and you want to know, or you want to know more about what I'm showing you here, check out his thread. It'll be a link there, as I've mentioned before. The next thing we're going to look at is cache size megs. So if I type in cache size, find next, we can see here cache size megs, which is at 512. Now this, you don't want it to be more than 50% of your onboard GDDR RAM. So on mine, on my GDR RAM for total 2 gigabytes, I have 2048. But we don't want this to be higher than 50%. So 50% for me would be 1 gigabyte, which is 1024. This is the number I want to set it to. That's 50%. I'm trying to maximize everything on here, and you don't want it more than 50. So I'm leaving mine at 1024. The original was half of this, 512, for a 1 gigabyte card. The next thing we're going to look at is more changes due to your onboard GDDR5 RAM. So I really hope you kept that in mind. We're going to go to max stale cache. I spelled that totally wrong. Cache. And you'll come to lines that look like this. The base values will be 100, 300, 700. We're just going to look at these first three right now. Now this is for a 1 gigabyte card. If I had a 2 gigabyte card, which I do, this would become 200, this would become 600, and this would become 1400. If you have a 3 gigabyte card, remember this is set up for a 1 gigabyte card. If you have a 3 gigabyte card, this would become 300, this would become 900, and this would become 2100. That would be if you had a 3 gigabyte card. But since I have a 2 gigabyte card, I'm going to set this up for a 2 gigabyte, which for me is these values. Next is your pool size, which also, if we type in pool size and find that, the pool size is also a value that is multiplied by your onboard GDDR5 RAM. This is for a 1 gigabyte setup. I have 2 gigabytes, so I'm going to make this 1400. If I had a 3 gigabyte card, it would be 2100. But since I have a 2 gigabyte, I'm making it 2400. Memory margin is the next line. And this is the exact same as we've been going over before. One line down. This is for a 1 gigabyte setup. If you have a 2 gigabyte setup, you would make this 256. If you had a 3 gigabyte setup, you would multiply 128 by 3 to get whatever value you need. Hysteris is limit. Once again, is a multiple value based on your GPU. If you have a 2 gigabyte, it's 40. If you have a 3 gigabyte, it's 60. I have a 2 gigabyte, so I'm leaving it at 40, which is double the original amount. Drop MIP levels limit. So these next three values are the exact same thing we've been doing before. All three of these are set for a 1 gigabyte GDDR5 GPU card. If you have 2, you'll multiply all three of these by 2, making them 120 for me, 120, and 120. And minimum evict size is 10, same thing here. 2 gigabyte card, 20, 3 gigabyte card, 30. Since I have a 2 gigabyte card, I'm going to leave it at 2. The next value is something I asked the creator for after playing around with the INI in-game myself, and I found that the character models didn't really look too great, and I think originally this next value, enable high poly characters, was set to false, although now when you download it, it's set to true for better looking character models. So if you don't really care about the character model quality, you can definitely set this to false and you'll notice a bit of a performance improvement. I would rather have it at true, and for me, setting it at true doesn't really impact my performance that much. It's still unbelievably remarkable. So I've left it at true because I like looking at the very nice characters and art style of Tera, and I definitely don't want that at false for myself. But if that's something you want more performance over anything else, you can make this false, and that will help you. The next line we're going to look at is one that's also very important for your onboard RAM. We're going to type in flight primitive. Oops, I included an extra little parentheses. Type in flight primitive, find next, and you'll find these two lines for memory pools. Now you don't want this to be more than 25% of your onboard system RAM. This is not the GDDR5 RAM we've been talking about this whole time. This is your onboard system RAM. For me, I have 12 gigabytes. The creator of this guide has 8. And in order to figure out what value you need here, I'm going to open my calculator as an example. So we know that 1 gigabyte is 1024 MB. So since I have 12 gigabytes of RAM on my system, I can multiply that number by 12. You get 12,288 MB. Now if I multiply this by 0.25, I'll get 25% of that. So 25% of my onboard system RAM of 12 gigabytes is 3072. That is the value I will enter here, 3072. And that's 25% of my onboard system RAM. For you, it might be something different. Let's say you had 16 gigabytes of RAM. So you would take 1024, multiply it by your total system RAM of 16. That'll get you 16,384. You'll then multiply that by 0.25, and that's the number you would use. That's 25% of your 16 gigabyte RAM on your system, and that would go in both of these blocks, the same number. The next we're going to look at is one frame thread lag. So if we type in one frame thread, that should take us to these two. Now these two are for GPU and CPU bottlenecks. Now as we know, Tera is a CPU hog, and most of the time your CPU will bottleneck in your gameplay. If your CPU is your bottleneck, you'll want that to be true, and you'll want your one frame GPU lag to be false. These two must be opposites. If you make this true, if you make your GPU lag true, that is totally spelled wrong. If you make this true, this will have to be false. If you leave this at true, this next one will have to be false. They have to be opposites. Now, this is something you'll have to test on your own. I can't tell you if your GPU will be the bottleneck or your CPU. For me, the game runs flawlessly with this setup. If I switch these two, the game runs horrifically, terribly bad. But this is something that you can experiment with yourself. The next we're going to look at is allow D311. Allow D311. Oops, that's spelled wrong. D3D11. My mistake. True and false. If your GPU card supports DirectX 11, something you can look up online, find out if whatever card you have supports DirectX 11, you'll add true here, and you'll leave this Direct10 as false. If your card does not support DirectX 11 and support DirectX 10, you'll make DirectX 10 true, and you can make DirectX 11 false. The last couple of things I want to cover would be these last few bits at the bottom of my Word file I have over here. The first thing we're going to look at is skeletal mesh. skeletal mesh LOD bias. There we go, skeletal mesh LOD bias. Now these are the effects of a LOD bias. From what I understand, is something that's very far away will render poorly, something very close will render much better or in much more detail. The lower you have this value, say the lowest possible, -1, no matter what distance something is away, it will render at its full quality. If you have it at 4, it will have to be very close before it renders its full quality. Now this can save you a lot of FPS because you're not going to be worried, your computer's not going to be worried about rendering things in full detail very far away. So keep this in mind about this -1 being the top, all the way to 4 being the worst. And these 4 values here, mesh LOD bias, particle LOD bias, detail mode, and shadow filter quality, all follow that same rule. Now these are the default settings. If you're having a lot of FPS trouble, you can experiment with making these all 4 and see how that affects your gameplay. For me, I'm going to leave them at 2 because it seems to work for me, and for what I've experienced in game, all of the textures and everything are perfectly fine for what I like. Next, if you go a couple lines down, you'll see max anisotropy and max multisamples. Max multisamples is something the Unreal 3 engine, as said by Techdude in his thread, does not handle very well. And he left this at 0, and I will too, because, as I just said, Unreal 3 engine doesn't handle this very well, and it's not really worth it to turn this setting up at all. If, however, you have a very powerful GPU, you can change the max anisotropy for better quality at the cost of performance. The values you can change it to, as said in the thread, are 2 or 4 or 8 or 16. Those are the values you can afford to change it to if you want to increase quality and decrease performance. But since this is a performance guide, we're not sacrificing anything for our performance. So I'm going to leave that at 0. The last thing you can see is if you scroll down a little bit and find these texture groups. Now these are of how all the textures render far away and close up in the game. Now I left these all at their default values of 1 and 0. In some cases you'll find a -1, and if you want to, you can go ahead and change these values to higher numbers. If you wanted worse quality, you can change these to those 2 through 4 and make it so farther away things are not rendered very well, and as you get closer they're rendered a little bit more. This will save a lower end PC a lot of stress by changing these values for LOD biases. And it's something you'll have to figure out on your own based on your system settings and what you can handle. For me, the default lines work perfectly well. They might not work for you, and you might have to turn these numbers up to higher values, depending on what works for you. The last thing I want to mention is if we travel back up to max stale cache. This is something I didn't mention in the beginning because I wanted to go through with the specific enhancements for you. But if you have a very low-end PC and you're looking for performance improvements, especially if you're on a laptop with bad cooling, these numbers will have to be halved. So these original values of these max cache size, the original value of 100, you'll want to make this 50. You'll want to make this original value of 300, change that to 150. And this will help keep your power consumption down and your heat down. But on my PC or on my laptop computer, I have a pretty excellent cooling system and can afford to turn these values up to their maximum states allowed by my GPU, which was covered earlier. And as far as that goes for changes in the INI, that's everything you have to do. If you're in for a good read and some more information, there's definitely a ton more lines you can take a look at. Of course, these are labeled by line number, so you will have to use the original Notepad and not Notepad++ to take a look at these. And that's all we're going to cover for these changes. But there is one extra thing we'll have to do in addition to get a few more changes done. Just as a quick reminder, before you exit this custom ini file, remember to save it, file and save, and then remember to close out of it. And if you're like me and just want to make sure it doesn't get overwritten, as I covered with the input ini, you can right click properties, read only, apply, and OK. Simple as that. Now it won't get overwritten. Of course, I think Techdude here says you don't have to do this, but I'm doing it because I had a file overwritten once for my field of view, and I don't want to have to redo that again, so I always make them read only. And the last thing we have to do for this guide, especially if you enabled the DirectX 11, is add a couple of things to our Tera shortcut. Now this is something I will cover in, I think, the next video, if not a later video, where we'll make a shortcut of Tera. And just to show you again, what exactly you need to do, you're going to go to your C drive or wherever you have Tera installed. For me, program files 86. Oops, that's not it. Tera, and then you'll find teralauncher.exe. You'll right click on this, go to, where is create shortcut, damn it, create shortcut. Then you'll take this shortcut and drag it onto your desktop or wherever else you want to have a shortcut installed. For me, it's easiest on the desktop, so I'm going to leave it there. Now, of course, this will be covered again later, but there are some extra lines here that we need to add. You'll right-click on this Tera shortcut, go to Properties, and you'll see this line pop up in quotation marks. Now it'll have an ending quotation marks. Don't worry about this use all available cores right now. That's something that's going to be covered in the next guide. But from this guide, what we'll need to add is a spacebar dash vsync in all caps, just like that. Another spacebar, a dash capital D 3 capital D 11. Another spacebar dash and no Steam. If you're not using Steam, which I'm not using Steam, so I'm adding that in there. These things are command line prompts for the game that will tell it to do certain things. As I said earlier, the use all available cores will be covered in the next video, so you can figure out what that is later, but make sure from this guide that you add this vsync, D3, D11, and no Steam. And that will complete the ini guide by Techdude and all of the improvements you can have from that ini. Once again, make sure to customize it as per your system settings and enjoy the game like you've never seen it before.